24 hours ago, nobody was talking about Mercedes. Now, the entire Formula One paddock is watching them. Because in China, during sprint qualifying, something happened that instantly raised questions. George Russell delivered a stunning lap to take pole position. Kimi Antonelli locked out the front row. A Mercedes won too, and the gap to the rest of the grid looked massive. Ferrari 4th and 6th, McLaren chasing, Red Bull nowhere close. But the real shock came moments after the session ended, because Lewis Hamilton, now driving for Ferrari, revealed something that instantly caught attention across the paddock. He hinted that the Mercedes W17 might already be operating at a level the rest of the grid still does not fully understand. Not just fast, incredibly efficient, especially under the brand new 2026 hybrid regulations. And when a driver with Hamilton's experience starts talking about another team's efficiency, engineers start listening very carefully, because the data from Shanghai is impossible to ignore. Russell on pole, Mercedes locking out the front row, and the car looking unbelievably strong on the longest straight of the circuit, which raises a question that teams inside the paddock are already whispering. Has Mercedes discovered something in the new regulations that nobody else has figured out yet? And if that is true, the Mercedes W17 might not just be fast. It might be the car everyone else is about to spend the entire season trying to understand. But the real story behind Mercedes' sudden dominance in China actually started much earlier. Long before George Russell crossed the line for that pole lap. Long before the timing screens shocked the paddock. Because the first warning signs appeared during the only practice session of entire Chinese Grand Prix weekend. Just 1 hour. That is all the teams had to understand the circuit, adapt their setups, and prepare for sprint qualifying. And in modern Formula One, 1 hour is almost nothing. If your car arrives well prepared, you look comfortable immediately. If it does not, the entire weekend becomes a struggle. From the very first laps in Shanghai, the Mercedes W17 looked calm, stable, predictable. George Russell quickly found rhythm. Through the long opening spiral of the circuit, the car looked planted. Through the middle sector, the balance looked smooth. But the real difference appeared on the straights. Every time Russell exited the final hairpin and accelerated onto the massive Shanghai straight, the Mercedes simply surged forward. The acceleration looked clean. The hybrid deployment looked perfectly controlled. And the car kept gaining speed for longer than many of its rivals. That detail immediately caught the attention of engineers from other teams. Because under the brand new 2026 regulations, hybrid energy management has become one of the most decisive performance factors in Formula One. It is no longer just about aerodynamics. It is about how efficiently the car harvests energy under braking and how intelligently it deploys that energy down the straights. If a team gets that balance right, the advantage can be enormous. And during practice in China, Mercedes already looked extremely comfortable with that balance. Meanwhile, Ferrari looked competitive, but slightly behind. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc both showed solid pace. The SF26 looked balanced through the corners. The rear of the car stable. Tire management promising, but the car did not look explosive, particularly on the long straights. Ferrari had actually arrived in China with one of the most talked about innovations of the weekend. A radical rotating rear wing concept. Fans quickly nicknamed it the Macarena wing. The idea was simple. Create a rear wing that could rotate enough to dramatically reduce drag at high speed, effectively creating a stronger natural DRS effect. In theory, the design could add between 5 and 8 kilometers per hour of top speed on the straights. But there was a problem. The concept also made the car extremely sensitive. Small changes in pitch could suddenly stall the diffuser and create instability. After testing it in practice, Ferrari made a surprising decision. Just before sprint qualifying, the team removed the experimental wing and returned to a more conventional configuration. That choice made the car more predictable. But it also meant Ferrari gave up some of the straight-line advantage they were hoping to gain. Meanwhile, Mercedes looked comfortable with their own package. The car did not appear nervous. It did not appear difficult to drive. And when engineers compared sector data from practice, one pattern immediately appeared. The Mercedes W17 was incredibly efficient in the final sector, the exact part of the lap that leads onto the longest straight in Shanghai. At that moment, some engineers in rival teams began quietly asking themselves a very interesting question. What exactly has Mercedes discovered in the new hybrid rules that the rest of the grid still has not fully understood? Then sprint qualifying began, and that is when everything suddenly became obvious. because the early phase of the session actually looked competitive. Russell set the first benchmark, but for a moment, Ferrari appeared close. Lewis Hamilton briefly placed his SF26 near the top of the timing screens. Charles Leclerc also delivered a strong lap in the opening phase. For a few minutes, it looked like the fight for pole could be tight, but as the session progressed, something started to change. Grip on the circuit improved. Track temperature stabilized. Drivers began pushing harder. And that is exactly when the Mercedes W17 began to separate from the rest of the grid. Russell improved again, and this time the lap looked almost effortless. Through the long opening spiral, the car stayed perfectly balanced. No corrections, no instability, just smooth, controlled speed. In the middle sector, the Mercedes carried impressive momentum through the medium speed corners. But the real difference appeared once again in the final sector, the slow hairpin. The corner that leads onto the longest straight in Shanghai. Russell accelerated out of that corner, full throttle, and the Mercedes exploded forward. The hybrid deployment looked incredibly smooth. The electric boost arrived exactly when it should, and most importantly, it stayed there. While other cars began to lose electrical assistance halfway down the straight, the Mercedes continued accelerating. The speed kept building, the gap kept growing. And by the time Russell reached the braking zone at the end of the straight, the lap was already something special. When he crossed the finish line, the timing screen confirmed it. Pole position for the sprint. And right behind him, his teammate secured second place. A complete Mercedes front row. Meanwhile, the rest of the grid could only watch. Lando Norris managed to place the McLaren in third. Lewis Hamilton qualified fourth for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc finished sixth. Both Ferraris competitive, but clearly unable to match the ultimate pace of the Mercedes. The gap told the story. Russell's lap looked like it belonged to a different performance category. But what made the lap even more interesting was not just the final time. It was how the time was gained. Engineers studying the sector data noticed something immediately. Mercedes was not only fast in the corners, it was extremely efficient on the straights, especially in the last sector. The exact place where hybrid energy management becomes critical. And that observation quickly started circulating inside the paddock. Because under the 2026 regulations, energy deployment is one of the most complex areas of performance. Every team is still learning how to manage it. Every team is still experimenting with deployment maps and harvesting strategies. Yet Mercedes suddenly looked comfortable, almost as if they already understood the system better than everyone else. Which is exactly why Lewis Hamilton's reaction after the session caught so much attention. Because he knows that car better than almost anyone. And when he looked at the data from Russell's lap, he understood something very important. The Mercedes W17 is not just fast. It is efficient, extremely efficient. And in the new era of Formula One, efficiency might be the single most powerful advantage a team can have. And that is exactly where the story becomes even more intriguing. Because when one car suddenly looks this efficient under a brand new set of regulations, the entire paddock begins to pay attention. Very close attention. Not accusations, not protests, but curiosity. Technical curiosity. Engineers from rival teams immediately began studying Russell's lap in detail. Sector comparisons, speed traces, energy deployment patterns. Every piece of data they could observe from outside the team. And one pattern kept appearing. The Mercedes W17 was not simply faster in one specific area. It was efficient everywhere. Through the corners, the car looked stable. The balance looked predictable. But on the straights, the difference became almost impossible to ignore, especially at the exit of the slow hairpin. The moment where the car must deploy hybrid energy perfectly to accelerate down the longest straight on the circuit. Most cars on the grid showed the same behavior. Strong acceleration at first, then gradually losing electrical boost halfway down the straight. That phenomenon is what drivers call clipping. The battery simply runs out of deployable energy. The car keeps accelerating, but much more slowly. The speed plateaus, and the lap time disappears. But the Mercedes did not appear to suffer from that problem. When Russell accelerated onto the straight, the electric boost stayed consistent. The acceleration stayed strong. And the car kept gaining speed long after others had already begun losing energy. That difference might only be a few kilometers per hour. But in Formula One, a few kilometers per hour across an entire straight can mean several tenths of a second. And several tenths of a second is the difference between pole position and fourth place. Lewis Hamilton understood that immediately. After the session, when he looked at the data and spoke with reporters, his reaction was calm, but revealing, because he acknowledged something many engineers were already starting to suspect. The Mercedes package right now looks extremely efficient under the new hybrid regulations, particularly in how it manages energy deployment across long straights. And Hamilton knows exactly how powerful that advantage can be. He spent years inside the Mercedes system. He knows how deeply that team focuses on energy optimization, not just raw engine power, but how the entire hybrid system works together. The harvesting, the battery deployment, the cooling systems, the software that decides when and how energy is released. All of those elements must work perfectly together. And right now, the Mercedes W17 appears to have found a very effective balance. Meanwhile, Ferrari is still searching. The SF26 looks solid, balanced, competitive in several sectors. But the car still lacks that explosive qualifying performance that Mercedes demonstrated in Shanghai. Hamilton qualified 4th, Leclerc 6th, both drivers close enough to stay in the fight, but still clearly behind the Mercedes pair at the front, which explains why Hamilton's comments created so much discussion inside the paddock. Because when a driver with his experience points out how efficient a rival car looks, people listen very carefully. That does not mean something illegal is happening. Far from it. But it does mean one thing. The fastest car on the grid suddenly becomes the most studied car on the grid. Every detail analyzed, every onboard video studied, every acceleration trace examined, because the rest of Formula One now wants to understand one very simple question. What exactly has Mercedes discovered inside the new 2026 regulations that the rest of the grid is still trying to figure out?